the CFPR weekly seminar series. Today is our great pleasure to invite Professor Ekatarina HERTOG to give us interesting presentation. So before we start, so let me briefly introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Ekatarina HERTOG. She is an associate professor of AI and Society at Oxford Internet Institute and Institute for Ethics in AI at University of Oxford. Her current research interests lie at the intersection of digital technology, digital sociology, and family sociology. She leads the ESRC-funded domestic AI project that scopes new technologies' potential to free up time now locked to unpaid domestic labor and measures how willing people are to introduce these technologies into their private lives. So the topic of her today's presentation is Who Wants a Smart Wife? Gender and Educational Differences in Willingness to Use Technology for Domestic Work Across Europe. So now I'm giving the time to our speaker, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Senhun. I hope everyone sorry with the names. I hope everyone can hear me well and see my slides, and yeah, don't hesitate to interrupt me if there's any difficulty. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present my current work in progress. As Senhu said, the title is Who Wants the Smart Wife? And this is a collaborative work together with Professor Leah Rupana and Professor Brendan Churchill, based at the University of Melbourne. So I think, just to start over straight away, I think given the audience today, probably don't need to speak too much about the importance of domestic work, so I will do this quite briefly. As we probably all would agree, household labor is critical to health and well-being. I think the picture on my right captures it quite nicely. Societies cannot really function well without meals being cooked, elderly, the sick, children being cared for, laundry happening, and so on. And this really shows that capitalism really relies on unpaid domestic work. It's really important type of work. It's also very time consuming, and it's also shared unequally between households. As we know, everywhere in the world, women, for example, women do more unpaid domestic work, which includes housework and care work, than men do. And in another example, poorer households tend to spend more time on this kind of labor than richer households, for example. And this work also comes at a price. We've all heard of motherhood penalty, or perhaps more precisely caregiver penalty, which refers to the hit on wages and short-term wages and lifelong income that individuals who engage in significant care provision, like raising children, for example, but could be caring for elderly, sick, and so on, inevitably take on their incomes. So domestic work is important, time consuming, and has serious consequences on individual outcomes. Digital technologies are now promising to address that at some point. Some of it is quite sort of futuristic, friendly robots caring for the elderly, but other things are sort of already here and are on our doorstep, like robotic vacuum cleaners and online shopping digital apps, for example. So there has been, while paid work automation has attracted a lot of attention, there's a huge, robust literature which, which looks at the future of paid work, as it's referred to. An early study that published by two colleagues here at the University of Oxford, Carl Frey and Michael Osborne, had a very dramatic prediction that 47% of occupations in the US are at risk of automation. Later studies came up with much more moderate predictions, but this is a big literature. There's a lot of arguments about it. Sort of big stars in the field of economics argue how to measure it, and so on. There has been no comparable research in the future of unpaid work. And yet, if robots are going to steal our jobs, could they maybe at least also take out our trash? Are they there? Do they have the capabilities, or is unpaid work beneath them? Well, while I haven't seen much academic work beyond my own project that I will also refer to a little bit later, if we look at specifically at companies and consumers, there actually seems to be a lot of interest. And this is what this graph tells us about. This graph is based on the annual reports that's published by the International Federation of Robotics every year. They started publishing their reports from 2008, but they seem to have changed their methodology in 2010, so that the 2 early years, the numbers are just not very comparable. They're all over the place. So that's why I start from 2010. It's a very broad summary, and in the broadest of terms, the International Federation of Robotics divides robots into 4 different categories: household service robots, and these most commonly include robotic vacuum cleaners, floor mops, lawn mowers. Household entertainment robots, professional service robots, this will be various sanitation robots or robots used in hospitals and care homes, also perhaps at in office, cleaning robots in office buildings and so on. And finally, industrial robots, and these are measured not in units sold, but in units installed. And as you can see from this graph, in all the years, starting from 2010, which is now 13 years ago, the household service robots have outnumbered, at least in terms of units, all the other categories of robots. Moreover, not only they've kind of kept this dominance in terms of units at the very least, they've also have dramatically accelerated from 2017. So we've seen this exponential growth in the number of household service robots sold that is not replicated quite exactly in the same way in other types of robots. So there seems to be, while sort of in academia, we haven't paid that much attention to this, among the companies are working and producing these robots, and consumers seem to really want them and want them more and more. Oops. I go to the next one. Okay, and this graph comes out of my domestic AI project. This is it's a collaborative project. I lead the UK team, and I collaborate with my co-PI, Professor Nagase in Japan. This tries to sort of bring tries to look to create a picture of the future of unpaid work. So those of you who are familiar with the various predictions about paid work automation would sort of probably have heard about it from the media and so on, when experts are asked, you know, which kind of jobs will still be there, which kind of jobs could be automated in the near future. Well, we've split unpaid work into 17 tasks, 17 different tasks that you see on your left, and went out to the experts both in universities, in companies, our research and development teams, and marketing and business teams, and asked, what do they expect in domestic automation in the coming 5 and 10 years? And this figure reflects their answers in 10 years' time, how much time currently is spent on a given task. So we're not imagining, for example, if we're talking about laundry, we're not imagining you know, washing by hand versus how long laundry is going to take with a robot. We're talking about the current amount of time spent on the task, so already having washing machines, pretty advanced washing machines and dryers and so on. So given the current state of this task, how much time could be saved through automation in 10 years' time? And as you can see, the experts, again, have been fairly optimistic. If the average of all these numbers is about 40% of time across all domestic tasks, there's some broad trends, particularly routine and more repetitive tasks are seen as more automatable, and this would be like laundry or cleaning, cooking as well, dishwashing definitely, and also shopping seem to be particularly at risk of automation. And broadly speaking, tasks that we think about as housework are perceived as more automatable than care work, like physical childcare, playing with a child. Interestingly, in care work, teaching seems very automatable to the experts. As a sort of university professor, I'm not sure I fully agree that the robot could replace me, but here we are. So consumers want it, robots agree. Finally, I've noticed that in recent years, welfare states, and to give you one example, the European Commission published a report of how it sees the future of care and caregiving, both paid and unpaid caregiving in the nearest years. They published this big sort of report in 2022 in September. And one of the sort of prominent categories they expect, or they sort of advise, that digital technologies are used more, are brought into caregiving to make it more efficient. I mean, they don't talk about saving money, but that might be at the back of their heads. But they expect digital technologies to come in and play a bigger role in at least care provision in the near future. So given all these sort of things coming together, we think in this particular paper, in this research, that the time is ripe to start thinking, well, who wants these technologies? Who are the people in the previous graph? Who are the people who are buying up those domestic robots and are behind this exponential growth? And who are the people who will be, when these technologies come on stream, who are the people who would be keen and jump up at adopting them? This is an important question for a number of reasons. First of all, if people adopt these technologies unequally, they could, on the one hand, these technologies have the potential of, for example, reducing domestic drudgery, possibly reducing inequality. If women disproportionately do these kind of tasks, if now robots are doing them, then women are the first to benefit from these technologies. But on the other hand, if these robots and digital technologies are adopted unequally, then perhaps we'll see a rise in inequality in households, with some potentially richer households, for example, benefiting disproportionately, while poorer households being left behind, not being able to adopt them, and we'll see the rise in the gap, increased gap in discretionary time, for example. Another thing is, at the moment, this domestic automation is not particularly strongly regulated. There are various very specific pockets of when it's something that's borderline health automation. In the medical field, I think there's stricter oversight with the sort of things that will be allowed to go into elder care homes, for example. But if we use the same robots in private homes, that's different. And education, something related to children, but we don't have a very clear sort of robust regulation or set of guidelines or advice, at least, on how to think about it in our homes. And the companies don't seem to be under particularly strict, again, rules, but, for example, to protect us, for example, from privacy infringement. And yet, any of these technologies, particularly the smarter they are, the more potential they have, the more personal data they're likely to be able to collect in the homes. And if we have time at the end, we could discuss, for example, the recent Roomba, vacuum cleaner Roomba related scandal in this context. And the more private information these robots are going to be able to collect, and we don't have any sort of thoughts of who is going to be most at risk. If people are adopting them uncritically because of various pressures in their lives, because this is the only way they can sort of maintain work-life balance, then we need to know who these people are, and perhaps think about whether they need there needs to be regulation to protect them in particular. But at the moment, we know nothing about it. So this, what we're doing in this paper is just trying to start with a just general picture. Who are these people? Who wants the domestic robots? We thought about these in two broad sort of explanatory frameworks, one focusing on the needs, and that's maybe in parallel with paid work automation. So people who are particularly likely to experience work-life conflict, so women and potentially women in better paid occupation, we expect it will be particularly open for the adoption of domestic robot or smart wives, because it's in their interest to adopt them. They may be able to afford them, and they are likely to be particularly experiencing work-life conflict, and perhaps these robots could help them. Another sort of partially conflicting explanation would be that it's not really about who needs this robot, it's who is feeling capable and skilled of managing these robots in the home and is sort of happy and comfortable with interacting with them. And here we expected, based on the previous research, that men would be more supportive of domestic robots because they generally, on average, tend to be more comfortable with technology. And we know that, broadly speaking, technology, robotics are very masculinized domains. That those with more education would be more supportive, just because they generally tend to be more open, perhaps, to new innovation, new technologies, and again are likely to come more across, perhaps not the robots, but algorithms, work with computers and so on. And finally, a very direct measure, those who already use a robot in different settings. So those who have robots at work and work with robotic technologies would disproportionately be open to using them in the home as well. In addition, so this is this previous set of hypotheses was based on individual characteristics, but we thought that perhaps this also varies at the macro level, and we were wondering whether local characteristics contribute, and we could see that it's not just about, for example, my own education, but also if a lot of, or my own sort of work-life pressure, but if I live in an area or in a country where a lot of women work, there's a broad shortage of people to help with unpaid domestic labor. Women have jobs. I can't easily hire sort of a part-time cleaner, for example, and I'd be looking for other solutions. And so we were wondering if we will see any contextual variation, local context variation. We also thought that in some cases, here, the one sort of relatively, the most convincing measure we found in sort of levels of state support was state support for old age, that could be measured in a number of ways. And you'll see that in our model, I use a particular measurement, but we did quite a few robustness tests as well. So here the hypothesis is that if there is state support for domestic work, for example, for elderly care, then there is already provision. There are perhaps nurses and home visitors who are helping with that. And if there's generous state support, then people will be less open to introducing robots into their households because they don't experience quite as high level of a need to introduce technologies in their life to deal with any kind of care conflict, or there is less of a care crisis, that their sort of needs are already taken care of. Whereas in the societies where elder care provision is quite limited and much less generous, we would see more of a need and more of a pressure and greater openness to look for solutions in technologies, sort of outside the what's already existing framework. Finally, we were wondering if just richer countries, there is a greater exposure to robots, perhaps through media. Sometimes you pass in a shop and there is some, cute robot standing in the window or with an iPad taking a survey and so on. So people just come across, in richer countries, people come across robots more often, also in domestic settings. In richer countries, even if I don't own a robotic vacuum cleaner, my friends are much more likely to own it than in some poorer contexts. And there will be an affinity explanation in a sort of local macro level, with people in richer countries being more open, being more familiar with robots in various contexts and therefore more open to them. So the one challenge for bringing together both individual and contextual measures is finding the right data. And eventually we've done quite a lot of research looking into different surveys. If you have any suggestions for alternatives, I'd love to hear them. But at the moment, what we decided was the best sort of survey to use to answer our questions was the special Eurobarometer. This is a survey carried out in 2017. Again, some of you may be familiar broadly with Eurobarometer. There is a regular one. It's a survey that captures various opinions across European countries. And quite regularly, it's usually a couple of times a year, they also release special Eurobarometers. These are kind of ad hoc modules. They decide that this year we would like to know about people's attitudes to self-driving cars, and next year it's about smoking or bus travel. They vary in themes. And in 2017, they did a survey which had a big component about attitudes and technologies, a variety of settings. And two of the settings were, they asked about using robots for elder care and using robots for deliveries, for receiving deliveries with robots and drones. And we thought, well, this is a good proxy, as good as it gets for domestic automation. The big advantage of Eurobarometer is that it, in 2017, it has 28 countries. It includes 28 countries, 27 EU countries, and still the UK was there. Unfortunately, since then, it's been dropped. And not only, we don't only have country information, the countries are divided into local subregions. And in our particular sample, we have 178 local regions. The Eurobarometer can be linked in itself. It's just gives us a geographical location of the individual, and then a variety of they ask a variety of questions, so all kinds of demographic measures and so on that for individuals, but it can be linked. So Eurostat produces various local contextual measures for the same geographical, broadly the same geographical regions. So we can link Eurobarometer to measures like female employment, internet broadband penetration, GDP, and to really quite a very large variety of local contextual measures. So this is the strength of Eurobarometer. Its biggest weakness for us is that, unfortunately, the specific demographic measures are they're quite broad, they're not very detailed. And many measures that I would like to have, like individual income, for example, are not there. So we had to use occupations instead of income, for example. It's quite a large survey. Initially, they collect information from roughly 1,000 people per country. As you can see, my sample, our analytical sample is half of that, and that's because we limited it to only working age adults. So we dropped all the children and all the elderly, because we wanted to specifically focus on individuals who are particularly likely to experience work and family conflict. And that leaves us with around 14,000 of adults. Our particular variables, dependent variables of interest in the models are attitudes to using robots for elder care and for deliveries, because these were, again, the best available measures to think about bringing robots into private homes and getting help with some domestic tasks like elder care or shopping. And we use, in order to capture and to measure the effects of local variation, we use random intercept and random slope multi-level ordered logit models. We choose ordered logit models because the dependent variables are scales. How comfortable, on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable are you with using robots for elder care, for example? Okay, so this is the broad sample description on all the the core variables that we used, and we can come back to it. But roughly you could see the sample is half men, half women. Education. Yeah, the measure of education is also a little bit weird. It's linked up to age, and I'm not quite sure why they did that, possibly because of the concern about the differences of context between all the countries. So the education is measured as, finished education before the age of 15, finished education between the ages of 16 and 19, and finished education at when was 20 or older. So that last one is probably could be very broadly understood as a rather noisy measure of university education, and the other ones are below university education. Otherwise, I think the rest is fairly clear, but again, I'm happy to take questions on that or come back to this slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, here are the local contextual characteristics that we used. And what I wanted to show here is just the extent of variation between the regions that we, those 178 regions that we had in our sample. So the first one is percent of GDP that's spent on old age. And as you can see, sort of in the least generous, this is measured, this is the only one that's measured at the country level. This was not available at so there's 28 different measurements, and the lowest, so the least generous country, they spent under 5% of GDP on various old age benefits. And in the most generous one, it's almost 14%. The local GDP per capita and percent of women in local employment, this is measures from the local regions. So this 178 sub-regions that are located within or nested within this 28 European countries. And again, we see quite a big, huge levels of variation. For example, the GDP per capita, and this is adjusted by local purchasing power as well. So it's not, as you can imagine, there's countries like Romania versus Luxembourg in there. So the adjustment of how expensive these locations are is important. And but even with adjusting by purchasing power, we still see quite huge, this is just Europe, and still huge differences between the regions. And same as women in local employment, in the most sort of where women are the least employed, it's under 30% of women, of working age women are actually working, and in the most sort of gender equal place, it's almost 80% of women of working age that are actually in employment. Okay, this is the last descriptive. These are the two dependent variables that we have of interest. How comfortable are you to be? The first one is how comfortable are you to be taken care by a robot when you become old and frail? And I am presenting it as a difference from the mean across all the 28 countries. So I've calculated country mean, and these graphs, these lollipop graphs, represent the difference from that mean, and in a variety of countries. And broadly speaking, I think Eastern Europe stands out a little bit as particularly open to using robots for elder care. And on the sort of other side of the spectrum, we see it's more Southern European countries, very, very broadly speaking, looking just at descriptives. Another interesting takeaway from this graph is, as you can see, the attitudes to robots in elder care don't really map directly on the attitudes to robots, using robots in other sort of helping with deliveries. I think that's probably something, especially post-pandemic. But remember, this survey is from 2017, so it's pre-pandemic. This is probably what we're most sort of familiar with, and emotionally, it's just deliveries. It's not, there is no sort of that social aspect that elder care includes, but still, we could see that there's quite, particularly, I think some Nordic countries, with Denmark, Sweden, they are quite open to deliveries, whereas they're not sort of as much ahead or as much as open to elder care technologies. There's maybe more similarity with Southern European countries overall, perhaps being more on the negative side, but the two sets of attitudes don't map directly onto each other. And I especially presented the second lollipop graph with the same order as the first one, rather than doing it in a nice kind of ordered way to highlight this difference. Okay, then to just see if there is something there, I did this, again, this basic descriptive graphs. This is just scatter plots of country means, country level means of attitudes, and mapped against the logged GDP per person in these countries. And first of all, I mean, in these local characteristics, actually GDP, how rich the country is, doesn't seem to have that much, at least on this descriptive, doesn't seem to have a huge effect, at least on attitudes to the elderly. Differently from that, there is much, somewhat more clearer slope if we think about shortages of care providers. So if more women are working, that people seem to be, at least on these scatter plots, somewhat more positive to using robots for elder care, perhaps because there's just fewer natural carers available. Similarly, well, though maybe the slope is a bit smaller, but again, we see a much more pronounced slope than is the case with pure country level GDP. So countries with more generous provisions, more generous spending on old age support are less open for using robots in elder care. And here are the results of my multi-level models. In this graph, I left only the variables, I presented only the variables that we were particularly interested in. Actually, in the next slide, I'll show you briefly all the variables that were in the models as controls. It's just then it becomes really difficult to look at because it's quite squished. So I thought that I will use this more for a discussion. As you can see here, men are much more open to using robots for elder care support than women. So it seems if we think about needs versus affinity, openness to technology, openness seems to be more important. More educated people, the effect of education is quite strong. Again, the more educated the person is, the more open they are to using the technology for elderly care. When it comes to occupations, the reference category, these are these dots that on the middle line. These are coefficient plots, by the way. The reference category for occupation is manual laborers, and as almost everyone's more open to using robots at home compared to manual laborers, with the exception of agricultural workers, but they're quite unusual, and here the estimate is extremely noisy. Finally, if people or those who use robots at work already, so we chose work as a context because we thought it's a nice way to capture affinity, so being familiar with robots, but at the same time, it's very different context. So it's not necessarily that if you come across robots in the work setting, you will be able to afford or somehow also will come across them in a domestic setting. So we thought this was a somewhat cleaner measure. So using a robot, being familiar with a robot in the work context is also associated with being more open to being cared for by a robot when one becomes old. Finally, local level indicators are also seem to play a role. And as we saw in the scatter plots already, this kind of reflects the findings from the scatter plots. Countries with more generous spending on old age, individuals living in the context where there's spending on old age is more generous, are less interested in robotic care, and individuals living in the context where a lot more women are working are more interested in potentially exploring technologies in the context of care work. And here it's exactly the same model with all the variables that were there. And we can come back to it in Q&A, but broadly we controlled for age, having children, because we thought, well, especially with elder care, if I have children, perhaps I would be more expecting that my children need to care for me when I'm old and frail. Being married or not, urban, rural residents, and how poor, because there was no income measure, but there was one question asking whether a person had any difficulty paying for their bills regularly, and so we sort of use this as a measure of poverty. And as you can see, so the gender, education, and occupation had particularly pronounced effects, also using robots at work. And then the size of the local level indicators, the measure of the sort of contextual, very noisy contextual measures, especially the GDP spent on old age support, that's sort of at the country level. It's quite a noisy measurement. They were in some ways comparable, for example, with some of the age categories, and larger than having own children, which I thought was quite interesting. Okay, this is again the same model as I showed you before, but here we run it separately. We split men and women, because I was wondering theoretically whether, as I showed in an earlier model, women, it's men who are more interested in robots, but I was wondering maybe for women education effect will be larger, or occupation effect will be larger than for men. So maybe not all women, but if we look especially at women. So this is in effect, because the models are run separately for men and women, it's as if I put interactions for every single variable in my initial model. And the differences are not huge. If we look only at the size of the coefficients and not confidence, ignoring confidence intervals, then maybe the effect of the education, the association of education and the sort of better white collar professional managerial occupations coefficients by themselves are a bit larger for women than for men. But if once we see the confidence interval, well, they basically overlap for men and women everywhere. So broadly speaking, the trends are very similar for two. Well, what about, so we've discussed the elder care, what about the deliveries? And it's very similar. So again, this is more, the same model. I've only picked the particular variables of interest to present here, but we have all the controls as discussed earlier. The one notable difference between how willing would you be to receive deliveries with a robot or a drone versus how willing will you be to be cared by a robot in old age. So we can see, as one would expect, the percent of GDP spent on old age makes no difference at all for individual willingness to receive deliveries with a robot or a drone. And it makes sense. It shouldn't, sort of theoretically, I wouldn't know why it should make a difference. Interestingly, GDP becomes slightly significant, and where there are more working women, there is more interest in getting using robots or apps to help out with shopping, it seems. Okay, and this is the same model ran separately for men and women. And again, as with elder care, if we only look at coefficient sizes, the coefficients seem to be somewhat larger for women, but the confidence intervals overlap throughout. So we can't really speculate about any particularly pronounced gender differences in attitudes. So to broadly sum up, the individual characteristics play a big role. And what we have seen as well in the sort of size, looking at the size coefficient sizes, is particularly gender, education, and some occupational characteristics. So perhaps more people in professional, managerial, or white collar jobs, and particularly seem to be especially open to using robots to help with domestic work. The size of the coefficients for individuals are larger than the size of the local characteristics. At the same time, local characteristics play a role, and I think it's notable because the measures are the best we could find, but I would have liked sort of better measures both for individuals with I would like to control for personal income, and I would love to see how this dynamics play out within households, for example, as I was quite surprised that marriage didn't make any difference, so I think even not finding these results, even with a sort of fairly noisy measurements, suggests that they are there. And again, even on scatter plots, they were quite visible, but it would be good to have better measurements to try to tease out the causality. So we can now speculate that perhaps affinity to technology is more strongly, or sort of drives some of the effects, at least with people familiar with the robots from the work context, better educated, and more occupations that are more likely to be associated with the use of technology, such as computers, but also other more likely, again, to be able to use or to need to use at work other technologies as well. But at the same time, some of it could be personal income effects, and we cannot, in this paper, we cannot separate that out. And then coming back for the importance that I've already sort of touched upon earlier when setting out this project, as we have seen, unpaid work is automatable, especially housework. There's huge interest in, there seems to be a big interest in having at least some of this work automated by individuals, and companies think that this is possible, or experts think that this is possible and can happen in quite a near future. There could be some positive effects with automation of unpaid work, increase everyone's discretionary time. We could imagine the absolutely best case scenario where we can automate out the drudgery, the domestic drudgery, maybe scrubbing the floors, or what could be, in the paid work context, they talk about good jobs and bad jobs. So jobs that don't really have any social or interactive effect. But it could also have much darker consequences. There could be access inequality, with some people benefiting from new technologies and others not. Automating domestic work, especially the one that is more social, like elder care or child care, could lead to a change, and not necessarily a positive change, in domestic interaction and the time people spend together. There is huge risks to privacy, as the more complex domestic work is being replaced. Like, I mean, you imagine, Robert, some kind of technology that needs to help with elder care to be more sort of customer driven, or even just with cooking. A cooking robot would need to know about everyone's allergies, would probably be able to infer presence of very young children, for example, based on the amount of mashed food produced and so on. So there is risk, and some researchers are starting to talk about so-called care valence, which is the risks of care valence, which is care that involves a huge aspect of surveillance in it. So I would argue that we need to focus more in this field, and I hope there'll be more future research done on this. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to everyone's comments and questions.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. Yeah, so any questions? Okay, Mujung, please.
Hi, Katya.
Hello.
Long time no see. Good to see you here. Yeah, so thank you very much for this very interesting work. And so basically I have two questions. And the first, as you also mentioned in the conclusion, I was also surprised that, for example, marriage doesn't make much difference. And especially I'm also like surprised actually the patterns for like older age care and delivery are quite similar, right? Because my expectation would be, as you said, like this care work, right, involves like intimate and emotional dimension. And so I'm wondering, probably one like a possible way to capture this dimension is like for local characteristics to also measure like a family values in a way, right? Because you have covered like quite a wide range of countries, right? For example, East European countries might be more familyism oriented, I would assume, but of course I'm not particularly familiar with, but probably Western countries, Northern European countries might be like more individualistic, and so that variation might explain some of the variations. Just like a possible consideration. And secondly, I'm wondering that whether or not the current respondents' household has been using other outsourced help in their family, right? And so, for example, you mentioned that even the use of like AI can involve the issue of privacy, right? And whether or not you feel comfortable that being cared of by someone not your family. And so, for example, if they already have that experience working with like a helper in the household, and so they may actually experience that sense of feeling uncomfortable or like anxious, and so that may make them even like more reserved on using like help, non-familial help in especially care work. Yeah, so I want to hear about your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shengmo. I think these are excellent comments and thoughts. And I will look if I can get a measure, perhaps at least on a country level, perhaps from a world value survey on the sort of how feminists signal. I think that's an excellent idea. So that is just point well taken. I will see if I could get a good measure of how familistic the local context is, and if that would play a role. The other one is, I think it's a really, again, a great comment. And so you were talking about this, that some of it is already outsourcing is happening, perhaps by the humans. So here with the existing data, I think you're right, but I also haven't, among existing sort of surveys I looked at, I couldn't find good ways to measure it. However, Domestic AI project is finally getting its own survey where we are presenting people with vignettes, and we've just completed the pilot, and the main ones should go into the field probably within a month, where we'll ask 12,000 people in the UK a variety of questions, and we present them domestic scenarios where we say, well, you know, you're part of a family, you earn that much, this is your housework load, this is how your spouse works, and you now have to cook a meal. And would you like, there are different options. You can cook it yourself, you can ask your spouse for help, you can outsource and pay a human to produce a cooked meal for you somehow, or you could use this technology with prices. And we hope that with that survey, I mean, looking at the pilot data, we get some very preliminary sort of sensible results. We hope to be able to tease out the differences between human help, outsourcing to human help versus outsourcing to robotic help, and what drives that. Is it the perceived perhaps prices, or whether it's something else? Like, well, I was really interested, exactly what you're saying, going outside familial help, is it always the same? Is it, or maybe for care work it matters, still using a human is better than having this robot, whereas for cleaning the floor perhaps, I mean, Domestic AI is a UK-Japan collaboration, and in Japan, my colleagues always tell me that, oh, actually with some domestic tasks, it's quite stressful to have a human. In Japan, of course, in Japanese context, it's outsourcing is still relatively rare. It's much more women are just doing that. And they say that outsourcing to human can be quite stressful. You got to be polite, and the social sort of rituals of having this worker coming into your home. But if we could have a robot, they're really keen on that, because you don't need to be polite to a robot. You could just ask.
Right. That's a perks, right?
Yes. So yeah, I think this is an excellent question. I hope that, so to that one, I hope we'll be able to get with this new data we're collecting, because I haven't come up with a good way of doing the same with this, you know, much big comparative survey, which is great because of its, you know, variation, but has its weaknesses, and the measures are quite also broad.
Yeah. Thank you. I was also like a little bit surprised when you show the distributions. Actually, the willingness to use like a robot for childcare is actually not very low. Of course, it's among the lowest, but still, it is like a decent proportion, right?
Oh, but this is the expert survey, right? Did you see it?
Oh, right. Yeah.
So this is the experts saying that the technology could take over and do this amount of childcare for you. I mean, I am surprised. I mean,
yeah, I would assume that probably between these two types of care, like older age care and childcare, probably childcare is perceived to be even less replaceable, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I also totally agree with both of you, and I totally agree with that people's willingness to use AI robots were shaped by, you know, their family values, culture, ideologies. Yeah, it's quite interesting that I also noticed that the willingness to use is very low in Southern Europe. I'm wondering whether, for example, this is also related with their religion. For example, in the Southern Europe, most of them are Roman Catholic, and in these countries, people tend to emphasize family, extended family, social network. Yeah, so yeah, I wonder whether, you know, this is also related to people's willingness to use or trust AI or robots.
Again, a great question, comment, and I see some parallels with Zheng Mu's also, that about the familism. So you're also sort of bringing together the potential sort of religious antecedents of that. I think it's a good point. I will see what I can, I think on a local level where I could link to the regions, which just gives, it's a more robust, more variation for multi-level models. So I prefer doing analysis where I could get regional variation, but I'm not sure I could get that, but I probably can get the country level. So I'll look at what I could get on the country level, and I'll really try to follow up on these comments from both you and Jane. what I would ideally have liked if I could also capture the individual attitudes, sort of, that in a well-valued, the standard question, women should take care of the home while men should work, a child suffers if a woman, goes to work early or something like that. They're the standard gender attitude questions. And again, unfortunately, in this Eurobarometer, they don't have those. So we can't measure it on the individual level, which I think would be quite revealing. But in our survey, we do ask those questions as well. So we will hopefully in a couple of months' time, we'll be able to supplement these on, at least in the UK and in Japan, to show whether individual attitudes are sort of correlated, at least, to the way people perceive and how open they are to using robots, or whether it's just local framework. The neighbors are going to look badly on me because I'm never helping my parents and I just provide them with these robots.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so are there any other questions? Okay, so if not, I also want to ask another question. Is that, so I'm just thinking that use of AI and the robots will, for example, change people's needs or demands. So I'm thinking that, I completely agree with you. Using AI, for example, will, replace a quite large proportion of housework, childcare, and so on. But then, actually, the way people use the increased discretionary time is very likely to be shaped by their existing values or ideology. For example, even if there is more free time for women, and so I would expect that they will, for example, use the free time to do some other things related to housework, maybe, for example, interactive childcare or some other related issue. And in this case, so I'm just wondering whether so the use of robots or AI will really reduce the domestic gender inequality or maintain the gender equality or even exacerbate.
Yeah, that's a great question. That I agree. As we know, again, in the past, there is really interesting work looking at the introduction of like dishwashers and washing machines. And we know that while they did save time on laundry, they also raised hygiene standards, like washing machines, for example. And as a result, people were doing a lot more washing than they started doing a lot more washing. And therefore, it's not that the time got quite saved in a very direct manner. We do see, again, going back historically, I think this is the best sort of guidance we have for what the robots could do is, we see on the one hand, in the past, when huge new domestic technologies were introduced, as you say, domestic tasks were transformed. They started being done in a new manner, and some new ones even appeared, like when people stopped growing their own vegetables or spinning their own cloth. The shopping became quite a major thing, and the task was taken on disproportionately, almost exclusively by women as well. So I think the new domestic automation might save some time, but it will also lead to some social transformations. And the question is, which ones and how, they're going to be managed. I mean, we do live at a time of unprecedented, I think, work-family conflict with a lot of, especially for women, as we could see, for example, that women's work time is on the rise and childcare time is on the rise. And while women have been cutting on housework through some convenience, already available technologies, perhaps, and sometimes outsourcing some of it to men or perhaps other family members. Overall, I think there's a lot of pressure, at least at the core sort of work age time. So perhaps these technologies will help with some of that. But as you say, I expect that some time could be saved, but it won't be just direct reduction of time. So if 40% of the time currently spent on cooking is, reduced, will actually change something about cooking. Perhaps, if there's a fancy cooking robot, and I have very picky eaters among my children, I'll probably ask the robot to cook 4 meals and supervise that rather than producing one family meal, because that will at least increase family happiness.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, actually, I'm also quite interested in the statistics from an expert survey. So can you please introduce a little bit more, for example, who they are and where they come from, and how would you incorporate the results of expert survey into other results? So how can we combine the result from expert survey with other results?
Okay, great question. I'd love to talk about that. So the expert survey itself, we just got the paper coming out of it accepted. So I'm also happy to share that if you'd like more details. But broadly speaking, it's a proof of concept study. So it's a very, very small study. It's 65 experts, and we wanted to make sure that we had people both our innovation in that survey that I didn't talk about here, but as compared to existing prediction, surveys used for paid work automation, for example, is that we were arguing that experts are not a black box. They're not defined purely by their expertise. So I already spoke that they were machine learning, AI, computer scientists in academia and in business. But we also thought, well, especially we're talking about domestic work. So how about the lived experience? They experienced inequality, exposure to domestic work. So we got experts from 2 countries, specifically UK and Japan. And the reason we think, so if you look at the global measures of gender inequality index and so on, UK is much more gender equal than Japan, especially when it comes to domestic work, but actually across the board. So whereas in the UK, women do more domestic work, but they do about 60%. In Japan, they do 90% or more. If we focus only on cooking and cleaning, men contribute a bit more to childcare, but not that much. So if we think of experts, these are highly educated people. And we made sure we had both men and women. They lived in the UK and Japan, and then they were in different contexts. So we made sure we had people both in business and academia. And what we see, if you just look sort of at bar charts, you can't run any models because the sample is too small. What we see is that the predictions, if you just look at the sort of means and so on, they're different, and men and women make different predictions. People in the UK and Japan make somewhat different predictions. They're not wildly different, but there is sort of seem to be systematic differences. As I said, this was a proof of concept study. We're just working on alternative where we could kind of scrape a big data set of expert predictions with some colleagues and see whether we could run proper models with demographic characteristics, but this is something we're just working on. The data of our expert survey is already, we shared it, it's in public domain, so I can share the paper and I can point you to the repository's UK Data Archive where we put the data. So people are very welcome to explore it by themselves as well. I hope that answers the expert question.
Okay, yeah. So I'm also interested in how would you combine
how I would combine. Sorry, that was the second one. Yes, this is great. We've got another paper that's currently under review in Journal of Technological Forecasting and Social Change. What you essentially could do with these predictions, and I don't think it has been done before. So in the past, what I've seen with these expert predictions, people show us these kinds of bar charts and give us the basic sort of, with the paid work occupations, the basic kind of run of the mill, archaeology is very difficult to automate, whereas, paralegals are all going to be gone very soon because the robots can do the same kind of labor. Well, we went further. We looked, because we asked experts about their predictions, how much time could be saved on a given domestic tasks. Those predictions could be fed into time use data. As you know, you might have come across, they're called NTTA, National Time Use accounts. This is where, so there's just general, so I work only on time use, so I forgot the other acronym, but what they look at is when children essentially cost time to others. As a child, you receive care, you provide very little care, and so the unpaid work is kind of going into you. And then as a working age person, once you become an adult for a while, you provide more of it, especially women, but men as well. You're caring for children and the elderly and supporting various members of society. And when you become old again, there is sort of, it reverses. So we could feed the expert predictions on various domestic tasks into those sort of time use data and calibrate the predictions and make predictions with how these time accounts could be transformed. And my Japanese colleagues in particular, I have experts there on this type of accounting, national accounting. They are very interested, as you know, Japan has very low birth rate, lots of concerns about, rapidly aging society, as in I think other East Asian countries as well. They would like to know whether some of these difficulties and the labor essentially shortages of working age population could be addressed through technology, whether elder care could be reduced sort of substantially, and the load that fewer working age people could care by these dependents on both sides, the children and the elderly. So this is how you could use expert predictions, for example.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah. So are there any other questions? Okay, if there are no other questions, so please join me to thank Professor Ekatarina again today for this very, very interesting presentation. We have learned a lot. And so this is the end of the seminar today, and I wish you a nice weekend. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure to talk today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.